Why did Van Gogh cut off his ear? What secrets are hidden behind the mystery of his death? And what does the famous Starry Night tell us? Hello everyone, this is Ninashov, and today I will tell you the amazing and tragic story of one of the most beloved artists in the world, Vincent van Gogh. I read all his letters and compiled the most complete biography of the genius. Today you will hear many things you've never heard before, things that are inspiring, fascinating, but also frightening, and sometimes even shocking. Vincent van Gogh was born at dusk on March 30, 1853, 10 years before the birth of Impressionism, in the family of a Protestant pastor in the small village of Groot-Zundert in the south of Holland near Belgium. He was named after his stillborn brother at birth, and soon you'll see that this wasn't a very good idea. He was the eldest of 6 children. They didn't live modestly, but they weren't poor either. They even had enough money for a nanny, who, however, loved all the children except young Vincent. According to her, he was completely unbearable. From early childhood, his rebellious and sometimes quarrelsome nature showed itself, causing plenty of problems both for himself and those around him. "My youth was joyful, cold, and barren," the artist recalled. He left school at 15 and began working at an art gallery at 16. He became an art dealer, or a sales manager as we would call it now, at a large international company in The Hague, where his uncle was a partner. The Van Gogh family had art world connections, which could have been a valuable starting point for any young artist. But due to Vincent's difficult character and his stubborn and unconventional painting style, he would turn out to be completely unappreciated. As an art dealer, Vincent first comes into contact with art and, over the course of 4 years, achieves significant success in sales while also gaining experience and developing his eye. As a promotion, in 1873, he is sent to the company's London branch, then to Paris, where he visits museums. And for the first time in his life, at the age of 20, he becomes acquainted with the brightest treasures of the art world. He especially likes the works of Jean-François Millet and Jules Breton. Look closely, you'll soon notice their echoes in his early works. In London, Van Gogh falls in love for the first time with his boarding house landlady's daughter. But she was engaged and breaks young Vincent's heart by refusing him. Meanwhile, his first job becomes the second casualty of the future artist's complex character. Having gained experience, Vincent starts offering clients paintings based on his own choices, and if they don't comply, he doesn't hesitate to criticize the buyer's taste. Of course, this didn't help the business, and after several warnings, Vincent is fired from the almost family-run company. After this, the future artist becomes convinced that commerce kills art. There are no worse enemies of art than art dealers, he says, and he will carry this thought throughout his entire life. Remember it! His younger brother Theo, nevertheless, stayed with the company and would work there for the rest of his life. And this will play a colossal, I would even say a defining role in Van Gogh's life. Vincent returns home with a broken heart and shattered hopes and falls into a depression which after some time transforms into a new passion, much more natural for his family, religion. Van Gogh, 23, was a respectable age for a man in the 19th century. He should have started a family and earning money by now, but he lacks any skills. Young Vincent eagerly joins the family business, becomes absorbed in the many holy scriptures at home, and even attempts to join the Methodist Church. But they don't accept him because he didn't know Greek or Latin. Vincent took his lack of fulfillment very hard. 2 years later, at 25, he goes on a mission to the Mons region in Belgium, to the Borinage mines, where he spends 2 years, preaching among the miners. Here, in this gloomy land, where everything around him was so bleak that it made you want to howl, he becomes interested in contemplation for the first time, which soon becomes a passion for painting. He writes to his brother Theo, "From time to time, I involuntarily sketch a small drawing like the one I recently sent you. This morning, for example, I made a sketch of Ilya in the desert under a stormy sky. Several thorn bushes are in the foreground. In short, nothing special, but sometimes all of this appears so vividly before me, and I believe that in such moments I could speak about it with true inspiration." Vincent frequently writes to his brother, including an increasing number of his drawings. I'll give you one of the descriptions so you can understand how incredibly sensually Van Gogh saw even the dreary world he was in. Listen closely. These days it was interesting to watch the workers returning from the mine across the white snow in the evening twilight. When these people rise from the depths of the earth into daylight, until to such an extent they are so black that they look like chimney sweeps. You see mossy roofs scattered around, and in the evenings a friendly light shines through the small windows. Living black thorny hedges surround the gardens, fields and farmlands here. Now, against the snowy background, it looks like writing on white paper, like a page from the gospel. In this eerie land, only miners, their lives and nature exist. And Vincent becomes so zealous in his preaching that he even scares the locals and they start to avoid him. He starts helping the workers and even spends part of his salary on them. In addition, he submits a petition to the mine management to improve the living conditions of the miners. But this activity is directly opposed to what he was hired for, to calm and persuade. Vincent's salary is cut, making life hard for him. His brother Theo begins sending him money for the first time, mentioning it in his letters. From this moment on, and until the end of his brother's life, Theo will send his brother money every month. Soon, his interest in painting overtakes his passion for preaching. Van Gogh sketches often and frequently discusses painting in letters to his brother. He also talks a lot and worries about being worthless. He is already 27 years old and he doesn't see anything in his life that attracts him. But most importantly, something that would allow him to earn a living and exist. Finally meeting his family's and father's expectation after they were upset by his sudden disappearance. And in 1880, at the age of 27, he made a decision that would be fateful both for himself and for the whole world. He decides to devote himself to art, but as he sees it himself, and this will bring him quite a bit of trouble. Yet this is precisely what will make him famous. He moves to Brussels, where he befriends the Dutch artist Anton van Ropard and enrolls in the Academy of Fine Arts, where he studies drawing and perspective. Theo paid for his studies. Here, he practices depicting miners, inspired by the paintings of his favorite, Jean-François Millet. And this love defined the style and color palette of his early period. Dutch painting in general is characterized by extreme restraint and even gloominess. It is important to note that technically, pre-impressionist paintings were always primed with a dark color first, and then light spots were applied on top to mark the main highlights, moving from dark to light. And everything ended with white, which was used to highlight the reflections and the light parts of objects. That is why most portraits and paintings of that time have a dark background. That's how Van Gogh painted. His palette at that time was dominated by dark earthy tones, which perfectly reflected the gloomy landscapes of the mines. I should also note that by the age of 27, Van Gogh was thin, if not skinny. He dressed extremely sloppily and didn't take care of his clothes, which made him not the most attractive person in artistic or any other society. His difficult personality made communicating with the outside world complicated for Vincent. In other words, people mostly avoided him. He writes to his brother Thebe, "You know very well, I am often dressed carelessly. I admit this, and I admit that it is shocking. Understand this is due to money problems, lack of need and deep depression." However, carelessness in dress is sometimes very useful. It helps you to be alone, and that is necessary if you want to seriously engage in something that fascinates you. At the Academy, Van Gogh created his first paintings. I've shown them to you before, and you can see how clumsy and unskilled they were. Like any paintings by a beginner artist, it's not surprising. In fact, he was starting from scratch. But very soon the artist begins to have conflicts with his teachers. He absolutely refused to accept the conservative, strict academic methods and principles of drawing. It seemed to him that all these rules and requirements made the drawing faceless and sterile. If everyone does everything the same way, then what is the artist's own contribution? Where is he in this painting? For example, when drawing the human body, it was believed you should outline the contours before adding volume. But Vincent drew people in parts, and this extremely irritated the teachers. Besides, he was the oldest in the class, and this created additional awkwardness. As a result, he dropped out in less than a year. But looking ahead, I can say that it was precisely his stubbornness, his unwillingness to strictly follow instructions, that would eventually help shape the unique style of Van Gogh. However, it wasn't just stubbornness that played a role here, but also another Achilles' heel, Vincent's inability to paint human figures. But more on that a bit later. All this time, Theo sends him 50 francs every month in letters, and Vincent thanks his brother warmly. After leaving the academy, he visits his family and brother in Etten, where a fateful encounter occurs. He meets his cousin, Cornelia Adriana Wust-Stricker, and quickly falls deeply in love with her. He hastily proposes to her, but she rejects his advances with a firm "no, no, never." Van Gogh will repeat this phrase for years, not believing in its truth. Van Gogh is 28 and overdue to marry, but he remains deeply lonely, yearning for warmth and companionship. Unpleasant, anxious, jobless, messy, and very stubborn. Neither the girl nor her family wants Vincent as part of their family. And here again, the character of the future artist shows itself, which will bring him many more troubles in life. He does not accept rejection or lost hope and begins, by our modern standards, real harassment, stalking. He bombards her with letters and constantly visits her, lying in wait for her. But as soon as he appears at the doorstep, the girl immediately leaves the house, saying, "No, anyone but him." He writes to his brother, perhaps until, "You might hear rumors that I am forcing my way, but it's clear to everyone that using force in love is idiocy." No, I'm very, very far from such intentions. But admit it, to strive for Ka and me to be able to see each other, talk, exchange letters, get to know each other better, and thus better understand whether we are right for each other is a desire, quite reasonable and legitimate. As you can see, simple wasn't enough for Van Gogh, and he continued his persistent courtship. This caused a major family scandal, and relatives called his persistence disgusting. In the end, Vincent convinces himself that his cousin can't accept his courtship because of religious doubts. It hasn't even been a year since her husband died, and he becomes disillusioned with religion, never believing that the woman simply didn't like him. Riding a wave of skepticism, he refuses to go to church with his family, and they have a terrible argument with his father, and Vincent slams the door again. He moves to The Hague, where he rents a room in the studio of his distant relative, the painter Anton Mauve, from whom he begins taking lessons. And you, I think, can already guess for yourself that this won't end well. In The Hague, under Anton's supervision, he painted his first watercolors. Anton enthusiastically taught Van Gogh how to hold a palette and mix paints. But most importantly, he began teaching him how to depict models, people, a skill that Vincent struggled with and, looking ahead, would never truly master. Plus, finding models was very hard, they were expensive, and Van Gogh couldn't afford them. His studio was also tiny. And when the model struck a pose, Vincent had to sit. And this made it very difficult to take in the whole model at a glance and assess the proportions, which artists at that time measured against the handle of a brush, sizing it up from a distance and marking the distance with their thumb. Ultimately, things fell apart with the models, just like with Anton, whom he argued with after only a few months. Van Gogh grew frustrated with his cousin's criticism of his rough painting style and, in an emotional outburst, replied to another remark by saying, "I am an artist," expressing his desire to paint as he sees fit. But there's also a hurtful insult in this, implying that his cousin, who strictly follows the canons of academism and brings nothing of his own, is not an artist. Anton was offended, and Van Gogh was offended once again. He left behind the ruins of what were once good relations. Being depressed after his cousin's rejection, Vincent, who had suffered from loneliness all his life, decided it was time to make an effort and put an end to his forced bachelorhood. You can't live too long without a woman and get away with it. In short, I came to the conclusion that I needed to find myself a woman, and God knows I didn't have to look for long. I found a woman, not young, not beautiful, not even remarkable in any way. A romantic failure traumatized Vincent, further damaging his already low self-esteem. His new chosen one was Klosina Maria Hornig, a pregnant alcoholic street prostitute. Can you imagine how desperate the artist was? How much he wanted to have at least someone close, someone safe by his side? He saw that dubious union as salvation. However, Vincent is thrilled to finally have someone of his own, even if they're lower in status with a dubious reputation, but not judgmental and even reliant on him. From Van Gogh. A brilliant business plan is brewing in Van Gogh's mind. She will pose for him for free, a luxury he never had, and he will sell her portraits, providing for both of them. But as we both know, that will never happen. Van Gogh sold only one painting in his entire life. He writes about it to Theo. When you wake up in the morning and know that you are not alone, and you see another being next to you in the morning twilight, the world seems much more welcoming. much more welcoming than the moralizing books and the whitewashed church walls that are so dear to priests. And like some love-struck 15-year-old boy, he adds that he intends to marry her. The entire Van Gogh family is extremely religious, and the family of the Protestant pastor is horrified by such news. And Theo tries to talk his brother out of this foolish idea. By that time, Vincent's financial relationship with his brother had finally been established. Theo sent Vincent money every month, which he spent on rent, food and paints with canvases. He was always short on money, but when choosing between food and paints, Van Gogh always chose paints. Theo made it clear to Vincent that his support did not extend to this ridiculous venture and that his brother risked losing his help. Under family pressure, Van Gogh abandons plans to marry Closine. Yes, moreover, even her relatives strongly opposed this event, claiming that Vincent was a worthless idler without a penny to his name. Their union falls apart. Lacking money, Closine returned to prostitution and died by suicide in 1904 by jumping into a river. After an argument with Anton, Vincent was forced to move out of his cousin's workshop and rent a small room which he now had to pay for. Then the tax authorities visited him too. Paint sellers whom he owed money to started hounding him, and one of them even beat up the artist. In the end, Van Gogh fled The Hague and returned once again to his father's house, who by that time had been transferred to Nouenen, a town with many weaving factories. The family was already fed up with Vincent's antics, instability, and inability to care for himself. This is how he writes. I feel that my father and mother instinctively think about me. Letting me into the family is just as frightening for them as letting me into the house. A big shaggy dog. He'll leave wet paw prints in the rooms, he'll be under everyone's feet, and he barks so loudly. In short, it's a nasty animal. Checklist. Identify main traits and behaviors, remove redundancy, retain key contrasts in character, ensure original perspective remains, preserve all proper names. Van Gogh was complicated, indecisive, insecure, and seeking fulfillment, yet also insensitive, pushy, hot-tempered, and often rude. In the first part of his life, he moved from job to job, eager to succeed, but repeatedly failed. The same thing happened in his personal life. 3 failed relationships, 3 women who rejected him, and a family, his teacher, brother, and father, who saw Van Gogh as a failure. He was a failure, maybe just as a creative person should be. And only Theo always stayed by his side, despite his brother's incredibly difficult character. You can already see that all of Van Gogh's early works are sketches of what he saw around him. Peasants, weavers, the gloomy landscapes of Northern Europe, wheat fields. The artist was attracted to real life. Its most natural manifestations, the so-called realism, which was strongly disapproved of by academic circles. You can learn more about this in my video about Edouard Monet. Lacking the skill and resources to paint large canvases and narrative scenes, he tried to practice on what he saw around him. The challenge of finding a model resulted in Van Gogh often using himself as his main model for life. He would create 34 self-portraits of himself, using his own face to practice techniques and color schemes. I'll give you an essay, and you'll understand how he saw the world around him, and most importantly, how poetically he perceived colors. And this is the first evidence, the manifestation of that very genius, which is still only beginning to take shape. Of the half-ripened. The half-ripened wheat now has a dark golden yellow hue, rusty and bronze gold, reaching its maximum effect thanks to the contrast with the muted cobalt tone of the air. Picture in this setting strong energetic women with sun-tanned bronze faces, hands and legs, wearing dusty coarse indigo clothing and black kerchiefs. On their way to work, they walk along a dusty red-violet path between the wheat fields, which are occasionally interspersed with green weeds. They carry a hoe on their shoulder and under their arm rye bread, a jug or a copper coffee pot. I assure you, this is something truly genuine. And in 1885, Van Gogh's father suddenly dies of a stroke, and after that, the relationships in the family become even more complicated. The division of the inheritance began, and Vincent, unable to stand the quarrels, leaves home again and settles in the parish of a Catholic church. Perhaps it was a deliberate rebellion, but the artist's family considered it a betrayal. Protestants and Catholics disliked each other. He would never again enter his parents' home, where he always returned after his wild escapades. I'm sharing details about his life to help you understand what kind of person Van Gogh was, what he experienced, and his personality during the most important period of his life. All of this was instantly reflected in his paintings and shaped him both as a person and as an artist. In 1885, after 5 years of painting, he created his first notable work, The Potato Eaters, which initially no one liked. I'll let Vincent himself describe it. In it, I tried to emphasize that these people, eating their potatoes by the light of a lamp, are using the same hands to reach for the dish that they used to dig the earth. In this way, the painting speaks of hard work and the fact that the characters have honestly earned their food. I wanted to give an idea of a completely different way of life than the one we lead, we civilized people. Therefore, I am by no means eager for everyone to like the piece and for everyone to be immediately delighted by it. He struggled with the painting for a long time, since it had as many as 5 characters. He made sketches for each of them, reworking them many times. 5 years of training were embodied in this painting, a painting of challenge, a painting of revelation. It was a challenge to the technical skill of a novice artist and a revelation of what touched his soul the most. This dark, earthy painting exudes hopelessness without any unnecessary decorations, showing the life of the poorest people whose dinner is just a single potato. Van Gogh really liked the painting, but what do you think? Did other people like it? Did anyone want to hang it in their living room? Of course not. The gloomy painting by an unknown artist didn't appeal to anyone who saw it, not even to his brother Theo, who thought it was too depressing. Restless, Vincent chose to sell directly to peasants and with Theo's help made 20 inexpensive lithographs. Their fate is unknown to us, only 8 have survived to this day. But I doubt that people who only had enough money for potatoes would buy paintings. This crazy venture obviously failed. He showed one of the lithographs to Rappart and he criticized it for exactly what Van Gogh was particularly weak at. By then, Impressionism flourished in Paris, but academicism still dominated in the Netherlands. That means the quality of a painting was judged solely by its realism and accuracy of depiction. Rappart writes to Vincent about this painting. "Why don't you study the movements thoroughly? The woman's hand in the background looks unrealistic, and why does the man on the right have no knees, stomach or lungs? Or maybe they're on his back. Why is his arm missing a meter in length? Why does he have half a nose? Why does the woman on the left have a pen from a tube with a plate instead of a nose?" And you still dare working like this? To quote Miles and Breton, "Art is too sublime to be treated so carelessly." You recognize exactly the same tone the critics used against the Impressionists. This criticism literally infuriated Van Gogh, and yet another relationship went down the drain. Consider this. Vincent, plagued by loneliness, quickly ends relationships with anyone who doesn't understand his art. On one hand, it's utter foolishness and incredible impracticality, but on the other hand, we see in it a blind confidence in his own abilities. Regarding Van Gogh's dark palette, there's a very important point to note here. In the 19th century, natural paint prices varied by pigment. The most expensive were ultramarine blue, carmine red, and vermilion bright red. Ochre, which is yellow or reddish brown, was a bit cheaper. Black, brown, and white were the cheapest. The palette of Vincent van Gogh's early paintings was so dark not only because the world around him was gloomy, and this was typical for the Dutch school, but also because he couldn't afford bright paints. However, just as he didn't feel them in his life, Vincent van Gogh couldn't interest anyone in his paintings. He is practically in despair and constantly complains to his brother that he is stuck and depressed, that he is always short of money, but he will not stop painting. It seems like he's sabotaging his own chances of success. For example, a wealthy relative of his specifically commissioned Van Gogh to paint a picture detailing exactly what he wanted. But Vincent only painted half of it and abandoned it. Then he kept dodging and stringing the client along for a long time, but never finished it. As if he was unable to first create something alien for money, and then with his own hands exchange his creations for base metal. In the end, he let his brother down, who had found the client and quarreled with a wealthy relative and missed the chance to promote his own name. Another time, his painting with oaks was liked by an acquaintance, and he wanted to buy it, but the artist simply took it and gave it as a gift. To him, can't take the money. To create art, yes. To sell it, turning something sublime into a commodity that was not in Van Gogh's style. At the same time, he constantly nags Theo to quit the dirty business of selling paintings, the very job that was feeding him as well. He claimed that art dealing was not worthy of his brother. He was confident in Theo's artistic talent and insisted that he take up painting. He dreamed of how they would paint together and make their way in the world side by side. And this duality of his nature, of course, worked against him. Without selling his paintings, he couldn't buy paints, and without buying paints, he couldn't develop. Meanwhile, it offered him no contacts with artists or learning, and Van Gogh felt suffocated. Moreover, soon a scandal broke out after the locals realized that the artist was persuading young girls to pose as models. And Van Gogh decides to leave for a place where he will have access to everything and where no one knows him. To the vast Antwerp, a major art center where he can start everything from scratch. There he enrolls in courses. Van Gogh, with Theo again funding his studies, practices by drawing bodies from plaster models. I'll show you these practice paintings, although they don't have any artistic value. But guess what happens in less than 6 months? In a situation where someone decided to teach Van Gogh painting in Antwerp, his palette becomes lighter. Here, for the first time, new chemical paints become available to him. By the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution had reached painting as well. Instead of expensive natural paints, chemical ones appeared, which didn't differ as much in price from each other, as a tribute to tradition, but soon even this difference will vanish. However, even in this situation, Van Gogh has no money. He mostly lives on bread and coffee, so he still can't afford the most expensive shades. Unfortunately, his desire to learn wasn't limited to painting. In Antwerp, he contracts syphilis. Although the disease was treatable then, the harsh treatment caused him to lose nearly a third of his already weak teeth. And at the academy, Van Gogh predictably had problems with the professors. He did everything his own way, and in the teacher's opinion, his drawings made the professors look like fools who couldn't teach an already grown man. And of course, he starts having conflicts with the academy's instructors. He refuses to follow their instructions, draws with broad strokes, and in their opinion, is careless. Notice, not exactly. Critics once faulted the Impressionists for this lack of precision in painting, but by 1885 in Paris, they had already overcome these outdated rules. However, these trends had not yet reached Antwerp, and Van Gogh was a complete nobody, so no one cared about his opinion. After months of struggling with Van Gogh, teachers moved him to the underachievers class, which deeply offended Vincent. He writes to Theo, "I must also say that while I still attend the academy, the home tutor's constant nitpicking is becoming unbearable and remains offensive. As a result, unable to withstand the dire financial situation and the conflicts growing around him like mushrooms, Van Gogh once again abandons everything halfway and, without warning, runs away to Paris to his brother." And this is where the Van Gogh we all know begins. Be patient, the most interesting part is about to begin. Van Gogh's Paris period will last a very short time, less than 2 years, but it will be one of the most productive and energetic periods of his search for his own style. In Paris, he moves in with Theo. Of course, Theo wasn't prepared for his brother's sudden arrival, but in the end, they worked things out, and Vincent stays under Theo's care. Here, when he didn't have to look for money, just to buy a piece of bread, he works very hard, visits museums, and finally gets to see Impressionism with his own eyes. In 1886, the very last of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions was taking place, and Van Gogh visited it. He is impressed by the bright palette, but more importantly, realizes painting doesn't require academic standards. You can experiment, you can be yourself, you can challenge conservatism, and still be successful. Although it took 6 more years for the Impressionists to gain a real recognition, they had spent 20 years fighting for the right to paint in a new revolutionary style. And although they had not yet achieved complete success, their names were widely known, and some of them could fully support themselves with their paintings. You can learn more about this in my excellent video about the Impressionists. Be sure to check it out. Definitely, the link will be in the description. Chemical paints in Paris were much more accessible. They were sold right in tubes, already mixed. And Van Gogh finally gets access to the most expensive colors, blue, red, and yellow. And soon, you'll see that these very colors will come to dominate his palette. Another revelation for him will be the Impressionist technique of preparing the canvas, priming it not with dark paint, but with white. Chemical paints didn't need to be covered with varnish, which was usually dark and dulled the bright tones even more. And all these technical innovations seem to turn on a bright light in his paintings. They just explode with color. That's what Vincent always wanted but could never afford. At this time, he's 33 years old. The brothers settled in Montmartre, the gathering place of Parisian Bohemia, and Van Gogh was able to start interacting with the artists of that time for the first time. He met Émile Bernard and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, becoming close friends with them, as well as Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, Camille Pissarro, and Paul Cézanne. For the first time, he was among artists who thought and painted unconventionally, standing out from the monotony of academism. A goal, not a crime? He also becomes familiar with Japanese prints. Japan opened its borders 30 years ago, and Europe was swept by a wave of Japanomania. Van Gogh, like many artists of that time, admired the Japanese art of hokusai and made copies of Japanese prints. Japanese art greatly influenced Van Gogh. These strokes, painted on pristine paper with gaps, would soon be embodied in Van Gogh's long, winding brush stroke, which would become his discovery, his signature, his legacy. At first, he practiced a lot on still lifes and landscapes, trying to copy the Impressionist technique. Look at how strong it already is now. Distinguishes his palette from the early paintings of that time, which can quite be called Impressionist. Short, somewhat uncertain brushstrokes, light tones and reflections. The shaded areas of objects also acquire different hues. They are no longer black. Dark, gloomy tones seem to flee from his paintings in shame, banished by the new, bright palette. I want to draw your attention to this painting. This is his first such experiment. A long, broad brushstroke that makes the painting resemble a comically primitive drawing. By itself, it's not very well known, but for us to trace the entire evolution of Van Gogh's style, it's worth paying attention to. But besides technical innovations, Van Gogh also becomes acquainted with the latest theory of complementary colors, which is shown to him by Signac, the founder of pointillism. He becomes so fascinated by it that soon the artist will use only those colors. Complementary colors are those that are located on the opposite side of the color wheel from the three primary colors, blue, red, and yellow. Yellow pairs with purple, red with green, and blue with orange. And the theory of complementary colors in Impressionism says that mixing a primary and a complementary color creates what's called optical mixing, which gives the painting dynamism and makes the painting vibrate optically. Van Gogh begins trying this approach. Take a look at the painting Moulin de la Galette. It's a windmill. Van Gogh painted it many times, but in this particular painting, he used his favorite contrast of yellow or orange and blue for the first time. Look at his achievements. I'll show you what this windmill actually looks like. Now let's go back to the painting. The windmill is painted in a bluish color, and this immediately gives the space a sense of summer haze, as if the very air between us and the windmill creates a soft, matte veil. It is the palette of the painting that gives character to what seems to be a rather ordinary landscape. And look at the wall. Here is that very contrast of complementary colors. In my opinion, it's still very cautious and not the most successful yet, somewhat chaotic. But we see that gradually Van Gogh is finding his style in Paris thanks to the abundance of contacts with other artists. He starts to have models, but it's still expensive for him, so he begins to experiment a lot on himself. Toulouse-Lautrec soon introduces him to Agostina Segatore, owner of the Tambourin Café and artist model, leading to a romantic relationship. Many artists gathered at the Tambourin Café and sometimes organized exhibitions there. Soon, Van Gogh paints the famous Agostina Segatore, sitting in the Tambourin Café, and several other works for the café, as agreed with the owner. Essentially, this becomes his first exhibition, but visitors and artists do not like his paintings. Van Gogh's still uncertain and somewhat immature brushwork seems unprofessional, rough, and too emotional to them. And it seemed like everything was finally starting to get better. But this love would not last very long either. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about the reasons for the quarrel, but it is known that soon after it, Segatore had an abortion, and most likely the reason was an unplanned child. Whether the child was Vincent's or not is unknown, but in his letters, Vincent writes about the abortion with frustration. After the quarrel, Vincent demands that the paintings hanging on the walls be returned to him as collateral. But the cafe owner refused to return them, saying, "Vincent, used her cafe and herself as a model without proper payment. A heated scandal broke out, and even a fight with some man. When Van Gogh tried to seize the paintings, Vincent suspected the owner had hired a thug to intimidate him and keep the paintings. Van Gogh, of course, couldn't tolerate being treated like that and slammed the door, but he was upset that he couldn't take the paintings with him. The cafe soon went bankrupt, and Agostina couldn't sell a single Van Gogh painting. Apparently, the priceless paintings were destroyed or lost. As you can see, neither the owner herself nor Paris saw any value in the paintings of the then unknown Van Gogh. His relationships with Parisian artists were also complicated. He writes, "In Antwerp, I didn't even know who the Impressionists were. Now I've seen them, and although I'm not a member of the club, I still admired some of the Impressionist paintings by Degas and Claude Monet." He brought his early paintings to Paris, and to the Parisian Bohemia, they seemed gloomy, rough, and crude. Everyone acknowledged his talent, but few believed that Van Gogh was already painting with enough skill. Toulouse-Lautrec admired Van Gogh's expressive brushwork, but found it too wild for Parisian salons. Camille Pissarro was very sympathetic to him, and advised him to work more outdoors, painting on plein air. And Paul Cézanne spoke of him reservedly, considering his style too chaotic and emotional. Soon there will be videos about Cézanne, Pissarro, and Toulouse-Lautrec on my channel. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Most critics, artists, and viewers agreed that Van Gogh's paintings were commercially unviable and not suitable for major exhibitions. Well, and as for the conservative artists, most of them just mocked his works. Segatori's incident showed Van Gogh that selling his paintings directly in Paris without an art dealer was futile. Van Gogh was one of the first to buy paintings from the Impressionists, and he also lent them money and supplies in exchange for paintings. Van Gogh painted 3 portraits through barter and displayed them in the back room of his studio, which also acted as a sales gallery, although he never managed to sell a single Van Gogh painting. Van Gogh, who cared deeply for Tanguy, ended up arguing with his wife, who wanted payment in cash instead of paintings. Naturally, this cooled the artist's relationship with the dealer. Paul Durand-Ruel, the main art dealer of the Parisian Impressionists, who practically fought tooth and nail for their recognition after Van Gogh's death, also did not find value in his paintings. Durand-Ruel played a key role in his popularization, but unfortunately, he never recognized his talent during his lifetime. The hectic and dirty Parisian life weighed heavily on Vincent. On one hand, he immersed himself in Parisian life, studied again at the studio of the famous European teacher Fernand Cormon, and improved his use of color. But on the other hand, he constantly felt like a second-rate artist. He was surrounded by colleagues who, while not fully recognized, were successful, often exhibiting at salons and socializing. And among them, a certain hierarchy was already forming, in which Van Gogh, unfortunately, was at the lowest level. Being far from the youngest, the French Bohemian crowd treated Van Gogh with respect. After all, he was the brother of an art dealer, but rather coolly. Van Gogh had only been painting for a few years and hadn't finished any art school. His painting style was rough and unusual, and all this made those around him treat him more with prejudiced caution than with genuine interest. The Impressionist group had split up, artists quarreled, looked out for themselves, and Van Gogh was often awkwardly caught in the middle. But he still managed to make friends with a few people. For example, with Paul Gauguin, who was as poor and unrecognized as Van Gogh, and with Émile Bernard, with whom they often argued about art's direction. Van Gogh didn't get along with the other artists, and this weighed heavily on him. I want to show you a painting that Van Gogh created in the summer of 1887 in Paris. Few know this, but this is the first canvas where he cautiously tried his signature approach, long, nearly parallel brushstrokes. Rhythmic geometric shapes are rare in nature and usually result from human activity. Fields, buildings, rows of grapevines, bridges. And it's exactly in this kind of landscape that you now see this technique, which he will soon start using everywhere and develop into a new style. Meanwhile, signs of mental illness first emerged. The tension of the vast, indifferent city mixed with the era's popular absinthe. Among the Parisian beau monde, the dormant consequences of past syphilis were brought to the surface, the most common of which was madness. He grows uncomfortable in the city, and Van Gogh again considers escaping. This time is to the south of France, as he said, a land of blues and bright colors. He wrote, "I will go somewhere to the south, so I don't have to see all these gatherings of artists who as people disgust me." Near the end of his stay in Paris, he painted 2 self-portraits where his future brushstroke style was already emerging clearly. Pay attention to these elongated brushstrokes, which he arranges in such a way that they seem to flow one after another along a path laid out by the artist. They radiate across the face like rays and circle around the lapels and the hat. Van Gogh's brushstrokes, like little hardworking caterpillars following the contours of objects and emphasizing their shape, create an effect of movement and dynamics that is completely different from the Impressionist brushstroke. This movement is entirely invented, completely subject to Van Gogh's imagination, and he, as a creator, with the help of his faithful assistants, constructs magic even in the empty space around his head. On the self-portrait, I will continue telling you more, and you should pay attention to these brushstrokes to this effect. This is Van Gogh's card. Paris still doesn't realize that the overt emotion in his paintings, which even Impressionists disapproved of, and his expressive brushwork and presentation. And they will become the beginning and the source of a huge and perhaps the most enduring movement in painting, Expressionism, which is still popular today, one of the 3 main directions of Post-Impressionism. Though living in Paris is getting harder for Van Gogh, he still doesn't want to be alone. And then his long and persistent desire to create, together with his brother, transforms into the idea of forming an art commune. A kind of brotherhood, a unity of like-minded people who have secluded themselves in the wilderness, far from the city, its arrogance and demands, working side by side to create new art. Art free from any prejudice, art for art's sake as the highest value in the world. He shares his thoughts with Gauguin and Bernard, and after receiving polite approval, in 1888 he leaves for the small town of Arles in the south of France. The place where his talent will shine, the place where he will cut off his ear and end up in the hospital, the place where he will paint the Starry Night. He arrives in Arles in February 1888. With snow still everywhere, he quickly paints 3 winter landscapes and keeps working as he waits for spring. It's just as difficult with portraits here. Finding a model in a small town is harder than in Paris. The locals don't understand this unusual job, being an artist who draws strangers. They're simple people, and sitting alone with a scruffy, skinny artist as he sketches you, it seemed frivolous to them. Girls were strictly forbidden from being alone with a man. So for a while he was establishing connections with the locals, Vincent mainly painted landscapes and still lifes. A little later, he found a way to approach the men. He paid them by inviting them to the local tavern, basically treating them to drinks in exchange for a portrait. I'll show you a painting where a typical feature of Van Gogh's later period first appeared. Spring soon arrived, filling Arles with color. This was exactly why Van Gogh came to this remote place, the paradise of flowers he'd been waiting for. He writes, we don't need Japanese art here, because I imagine myself in Japan, and all I need to do is open my eyes and to see what's in front of me. And you don't need to ask the trees to pose. He paints apple, peach, and blooming pear trees. And in this painting, look, for the first time, he very clearly outlines the dark contours of the tree, a technique he hadn't used before. After some time, this kind of contour separating different planes of the painting will appear in most of his works. This technique will later become very popular in France. In order to handle perspective better, Vincent invents what he called a perspective frame. It was a 1-meter wooden frame with crisscross strings inside, creating a converging perspective. Van Gogh used it to view the landscape he was painting and copied the proportions and perspective lines of roads, fields, and buildings onto the canvas. He was sure that soon all artists would start using it, and even sent its sketches to Theo. But experienced artists didn't need any tools to feel the perspective. The camera obscura had long gone out of use. Artists had learned to see perspective with the naked eye. That's why Van Gogh's invention, which he was so proud of, remained unused. Theo gets some of his paintings shown at the Independence exhibition in Paris. However, none of them were sold again. At the beginning of summer, he meets the local postman, Joseph Roulin, and paints his family a lot. His circle grows, and portraits increasingly dominate his work. His collection even includes a young girl, La Mosme. We don't know who she is. But it is known that there was a brothel in Arles that Van Gogh often visited, and apparently she was one of its workers. No other girl in this remote place would have agreed to pose for a strange, twitchy man. The arrival of spring and summer gives Van Gogh so much opportunity to paint that it hardly bothers him. Only loneliness weighs on him, and he actively writes about this to Theo, as well as to his Parisian friends Gauguin and Bernard, inviting them to Arles to create an artist's community. But Bernard is too fascinated by Paris, even though he lives in poverty. More precisely, he is fascinated by Parisian women, something Arles cannot offer him. But Gauguin is in such a dire financial situation, he was deeply in debt, that Theo has something to entice the artist and please his brother. He offers to pay off Gauguin's debts in exchange for his paintings, which he will put up for sale, and also to fully support both artists financially. In Arles, Gauguin thinks it over for a long time and finally, in August, agrees to the profitable arrangement. Van Gogh is delighted. He finds a yellow house near Arles, and Theo sends him 300 francs so that he can rent it and prepare everything for the future studio of the two artists. The rent costs him 15 francs a month, and Van Gogh happily moves there, but not before having his usual argument with the owner of the hotel where he had been staying, because of an excessively large bill. The Van Gogh brothers hoped the Artel would eventually grow into the core of a new movement opposing refined Paris. Well, for now, the inspired Vincent decides to decorate his and Gauguin's shared studio with paintings, and in August 1888 he creates the famous Sunflower series, first 3, then 5, 12 and finally 15. In total, 4 paintings. At summer's end, he met Eugène Bosch, a Belgian artist who visited Arles on friends' advice. In his letters he speaks very warmly of him, and in September 1888 he paints his portrait, which will mark the beginning of a new meaning in painting. Let me elaborate on him. This is how Van Gogh described him. Recently, I painted the portrait of our friend Bock. I placed him against a background of a starry sky, and there is something infinite in it. I wanted to show that, for the artist, there is more than himself or his dreams. Pay attention to the stars in the background of the portrait. In Van Gogh's description, they are the symbol of the artist's inner light, and this symbolism is something new, different from the strict realism of all his previous paintings. From here, the artist takes his first steps in adding elements of imagination to his paintings. Remember, in his early period, he argued with his teachers that simply copying reality is fruitless. These paintings lack the artist's presence. They're sterile, decorative, and standard. And here he gradually begins to find that contribution, the imprint of the artist's personality on the canvas, which will make his paintings unique. And this is the artist's imagination at its fullest. This small, timid step will evolve into surrealism in 20 years, brilliantly shown in Salvador Dali's paintings. I'll soon have a video about him on my channel. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If the Impressionists tried in their paintings to capture an impression, a fleeting emotion, which the beautiful external world impacts them, but Van Gogh goes further by adding what his imagination creates to his canvases. It's not the landscape influencing the artist, but the artist influencing the landscape. This will later be called Expressionism, an outpouring of emotions and the artist's expression on canvas. But for now, no one even knows such a word. He writes, "Instead of trying to accurately depict what is in front of my eyes, I use color more freely, so that I want to express myself fully. I'm working on a simple technique that likely won't be impressionist." Also in September, he paints his famous night cafe, Café Terrace at Night, and Starry Night over the Rhone. Notice how he paints the color of the lamps and stars, like shimmering, radiating circles. At night, in Arles, it was almost completely dark. There was no street lighting, and only the cafe was the single bright spot in the whole town. Here it already fully reveals itself. The floristics of the dominance of blue and yellow. I think you can already easily distinguish Van Gogh from any other artist by his characteristic brushstroke that outlines the shapes, the dark contour, and the yellow-blue palette. Van Gogh struggles to work. Years of hunger have ruined his health, his stomach is failing, and constant drinking and bad wine at the only cafe worsen things. Van Gogh often complains of being unwell, and during this time anxiety is mentioned for the first time in his letters. After his sister's mental illness, Van Gogh comes to the conclusion that psychosis runs in the family, and sooner or later it will catch up with him too. He already feels the impending trouble. He sends Theo one painting after another, but there is still no good news about sales. In late October, Gauguin arrives and the artists start working together. He is a very interesting person, and I am absolutely sure that he and I will create a whole bunch of all sorts of things.
He will probably create quite a lot. Here, I hope, as well. I feel the need to work until complete physical exhaustion and moral breakdown. After all, that's the only way for me to make up for our expenses. What can I do if my paintings don't sell?
Gauguin is also painting the night cafe, but notice how their styles differ. Meanwhile, Theo managed to sell Gauguin's paintings quite well, the ones he left as collateral for his debts. And then there was another sale, and Theo wrote in a letter to Vincent that he was very pleased. Theo couldn't manage to sell Van Gogh's paintings at all, and of course, this created tension between the artists. Artists are always in competition after all. There's nothing unusual about that. But when one of the outsiders suddenly starts to pull ahead, the other always feels it's unfair. In his letters, Van Gogh doesn't even hint at any rivalry, but right after praising Gauguin, he immediately tries to talk about his own new paintings. As if showing his brother, I can do it too, believe in me. Van Gogh and Gauguin work daily, then spend evenings eating and drinking at a cafe. Gauguin is very popular with the local women, while the sloppy, toothless Van Gogh is avoided by women. Jeanne Calment, who lived in Arles her entire life, claimed she met Van Gogh in her father's shop at age 13. She thought the artist looked dirty, poorly dressed, and unfriendly, and she refused to serve him. Because he was as ugly as sin, had a nasty temper, and smelled of alcohol. Well, as we already know, her words were not far from the truth. And in November, the Belgian Art Association Group 20 invited Gauguin to take part in their exhibition. This greatly inspired the artist, and he began making plans to travel to Brussels, where his wife lived. And here, Van Gogh's tone towards Gauguin changes. He writes to Theo with skepticism.
For now. However, he is popular with the women of Arles, and this, as far as I understand, cannot help but have certain consequences. He is married, but he doesn't look like a married man at all. I'm afraid that he and his wife have different personalities, but for him, of course, the main thing is not her, but the children, who, judging by the portraits, are very beautiful. Well, yes, you and I don't really understand much about these things.
Meanwhile, Van Gogh admires Gauguin's style and paintings, persistently sending them to Theo. Theo shows Van Gogh's paintings to colleagues and artists, but they say they're rushed and unfinished, mostly because of the awkward human figures which Theo tells Vincent about. Of course, Vincent took the criticism badly.
Waiting a bit for my new works to arrive won't cost you anything. As for the current ones, let our dear colleagues despise them as much as they want. Fortunately for me, I know exactly what I want, and accusations that I work in haste leave me completely indifferent.
Can you imagine working your whole life and never getting approval? To create hundreds of paintings at that time, more than 600, but not sell a single one. Not a single painting out of 600 works painted just to be put away. What kind of person would have the patience not to give up? What passion drives you to persist despite reproach, criticism, ridicule, and peers' painful successes?
If by 40 I create a figurative work as good as the flowers Gauguin mentioned, I can consider myself as good a painter as anyone.
That's why persistence, once again, persistence, he says. By figurative composition, he means people in motion, which he still can't manage to capture. This trait, seen as a flaw, sadly keeps his colleagues from recognizing a different talent in Van Gogh. The era of primitivism has not yet arrived, and Van Gogh was born too early. Although, if he hadn't been born, perhaps it would never have come at all. Van Gogh and Gauguin argue a lot about art, and their arguments are becoming increasingly heated. As Vincent said, they criticize each other's approaches. Gauguin says Vincent constantly argues and pushes his way, but Gauguin has his own vision and plans. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to coexist, and some everyday challenges of living together also start to appear. Late autumn arrives, gloomy and dull, and Van Gogh notices Gauguin, like nature, growing cold toward Karl. This worries him more than anything. He is afraid of being alone again, just as he has been all his life. And then comes the news that Theo has fallen in love and is going to get married, which means his brother will inevitably grow distant. All of this, of course, stirred the already troubled waters of Van Gogh's mind. Because of his fear of being left alone, he became suspicious. Mental instability, which had been worsening, became more evident. Living with Vincent was unbearable. Constant fights, anger, and suspicion. I understood that he was ill, but staying there meant putting myself in danger, Gauguin recalls. On December 23, just days before Christmas, one of their heated arguments became a real fight. We don't know the details or reasons, but here's what Gauguin says in his reproach to Vincent.
Life was hanging by a thread. That evening, you rushed at me with a razor in your hand. My look stopped you and you ran home. I spent the night at a hotel and the next morning I learned that you had cut off your ear.
That's how that famous episode with the cut off ear began, which I think you've already heard about. I didn't lead you to this moment in such detail for nothing, so that you could fully imagine the situation. With Van Gogh's fear of Gauguin leaving and his suspicion, a quarrel was almost inevitable. Just a small spark could trigger accusations of betrayal. I believe that's what happened. Van Gogh snapped and lashed out at his friend. But Gauguin was a good fencer, and apparently he grabbed his sword, which he was known to always carry with him, to defend himself. That stopped Vincent. Gauguin then left the Yellow House to escape his unstable colleague and stayed at a hotel. Vincent, frightened by his own aggression, in a state of severe nervous crisis and despair, wounded himself, punishing himself for destroying a friendship that was so important to him. Until recently, it was believed that Van Gogh only cut off his earlobe. But 11 years ago, records of Vincent V's attending physician were discovered. Arles Felix Ray, who admitted him to the hospital, clearly stated that the ear was completely severed. After that, events took an even stranger turn. Apparently, in a state of stupor, Van Gogh wrapped his ear in paper and went to the brothel where he often visited and handed it to one of the prostitutes. Rochelle saying, "Take care of it, it's like a treasure." Afterward, he went outside, passed out, and was found by police, who took him to the hospital. Alia Gauguin never returned to the Yellow House and soon left Arles, not even wanting to speak with Van Gogh. Van Gogh spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and upon his return, he painted his famous self-portrait with a bandaged ear. In the painting, the ear is on the right, though he cut off his left ear. As a right-hander, he likely painted it using a mirror. There are 2 versions of the portrait, and in one of them, he has a pipe to give the appearance of calmness. And this desire is also understandable, because the incident seriously worried Theo, who learned about everything from Gauguin. He immediately rushed to Arles, took care of his brother, and settled everything with the police. This breakdown, like a burst dam, marked the start of the artist's already unstable psyche collapsing. After Gauguin left, he began to have hallucinations and schizophrenic thoughts that someone wanted to poison him. In this state, he wandered peaceful Arles and scared the residents. 4 weeks later, he was hospitalized again with symptoms of paranoia and underwent a 10-day treatment. After being discharged, he faced residents unwilling to risk danger. Everyone in Arles considered him insane and collected signatures for the mayor to expel the dangerous madman from the city. Vincent van Gogh's life in Arles suddenly stops being comfortable. The residents avoid him. Gauguin left, and while Vincent van Gogh was in the hospital, the Yellow House's owner chose to rent it out again, even though the artist had renovated it. Van Gogh struggles with Gauguin's departure, fearing Gauguin will tell everyone in Paris what happened, ruining his already slim chances of success. But as if to balance out all the hell the artist is going through, soon he will make his first sale. Theo understood that Vincent van Gogh, in his condition, could not live in Arles on his own. Returning to Paris was also. He advised admitting his brother to the psychiatric hospital in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. It was an expensive, well-equipped institution that seemed to Theo the perfect place for his brother to be cared for and, most importantly, safe from himself. Van Gogh agreed and moved to the hospital in May 1889. Theo arranged for him to have a studio here, but unfortunately, it didn't have any windows. But the hospital had a beautiful garden with irises, and here Van Gogh painted his famous irises. He was allowed to paint in the garden and here, in the calm of the hospital, on full board, without outside contacts, without stress. The last and most characteristic and important quality of his paintings emerges. His brushstroke, once short and elongated, is now long and twisted. This is exactly how he paints cypresses and irises, repeating the movement of the leaves with the direction of his brushstroke. Look, it's as if we can see the cypress swaying in the wind. This is the final stage of his amazing style's development, when Van Gogh begins to model movement. And in June 1889, after a month in Saint-Rémy, Van Gogh painted his Starry Night. There was only one small barred window in his room. He paints in the studio, or garden by day, and watches stars from his window at night. He painted this picture from memory, and it became the pinnacle of his imagination. He painted it not as he saw it, but by laying his brushstroke over reality. He invented it completely. Such a landscape never existed. No one had ever seen such swirls in the sky, but no one had ever seen such dynamism in an ordinary starry night landscape either. If you've watched my videos, you know that artists very often painted from memory in their studios. Usually their goal was to reproduce what they saw as accurately as possible, aiming for photographic realism. Van Gogh takes a new, unexpected, I would even say revolutionary step here. He rejects resemblance and gives priority to the artist's imagination, to his self-expression, exactly what he always wanted. He transfers to the canvas not the image that remains in memory, but the dreams that overwhelm us. When we lie on the cool summer grass and look up at the dizzyingly bottomless sky, full of countless stars. The patient enjoys the clinic, he feels calm and worry-free there. And in the intervals between his episodes, he can fully immerse himself in his work, which immediately shows in his paintings. His style takes a leap, and his canvases seem to be woven from movement, from winding, swirling lines.
To me, from what I understand, I just need to continue treatment. Keeping me here costs less than anywhere else, and besides, I can work. The nature here is magnificent. I hope that in a year I'll know what I can do and want. Then, little by little, I'll find the strength to start over, to return to Paris or go somewhere else. I don't want to right now. My place is here.
In the summer, he sends several paintings to the Independence exhibition, including Irises and Starry Night over the Rhone. That very Starry Night, now his most famous painting, praised by critics, he doesn't dare to show. It seems too eccentric to him, and he has already been burned by criticism for his boldness more than once. Claude Monet unexpectedly says Van Gogh's Irises is the best painting at the exhibition. It truly is magnificent, isn't it? And that was the first recognition for the upstart and self-taught, unpleasant and untidy artist whom no one took seriously. This event was very important for Van Gogh, for his self-esteem. It's a pity that he only had 6 months left to live. In January 1890, he received an invitation to participate in the exhibition of the 20. He sent his red vineyards to it. The public's reaction was reserved, but the painting was bought for 400 francs by the Belgian artist Anna Boch. It was probably the happiest day in Van Gogh's life. Finally, someone bought his painting. His works began to attract attention despite, or perhaps because of, the rumors about the recent incident. Later, at the Salon of the Independence. In January, he sends up to 10 paintings, which the public receives more favorably. The public is getting used to his extraordinary style, and he is slowly beginning to receive his first timid recognition. In the clinic, Van Gogh became stronger, physically, mentally, and creatively. His own style matured and developed into something completely unique for that time. He begins to test his new strength and new style by copying the paintings of recognized masters, trying to conquer his last and most difficult peak, the human figure. His unique technique became its own aesthetic, turning his early awkward style into a focal point of his paintings. The artist's touch, naturally woven into swirling brushstrokes. Look at the painting The Drunkards, painted after the work of Daumier with the same name. Let's compare them. The long, winding brushstroke almost lets us see the drinkers' drunken, unsteady movements and distorted faces. A little later, in the same February, he paints his famous Prisoner's Walk, as well as a couple more practiced tributes. The Good Samaritan after the painting by Delacroix, First Steps after the work by Millet, and Noon, Rest from Work, also after Millet. Look at how different these seemingly identical subjects are. His paintings become true works of art. Van Gogh's style brings much more movement and plasticity to the subject than the academic manner. He creates a sense of fluidity in every landscape. As if the wind sweeps through the wheat fields now, sending waves through the seed-heavy ears, and then moves on to the cypresses. And they writhe right before our eyes like dark green flames ignited by Van Gogh's imagination. During enlightened moments, Van Gogh paints furiously in visionary bursts and experiences periods of enlightenment. They last longer. He feels more confident and wants to repaint his old works in his new style. He asks Theo to send him The Potato Eaters, The Gleaners, and The Diggers, paintings with figures that he was most criticized for. Do you remember the criticism he received for The Potato Eaters? Van Gogh chooses to give them a second life, realizing he now has the needed skill. Can you imagine what we could have seen if he had lived even a few more years? As Van Gogh grows stronger, he feels the clinic's atmosphere weighs on him, and the monotonous landscape offers no new inspiration for his paintings. The medication suppresses his emotions, and the other patients irritate him. So he and Theo begin to discuss Van Gogh moving closer to his brother.
The atmosphere here is starting to become unbearably oppressive. Me. Well, I endured it for more than a year, but now I need some air. I feel crushed by boredom and sadness. I have no more ideas than I could ever express. But that doesn't discourage me. My thoughts come almost mechanically. I take it as a sign that I'll regain my confidence as soon as I get to the north and get away from my current surroundings and circumstances.
In May 1890, Vincent had fully recovered, and he was allowed to leave the clinic. He can't return to Paris yet, and he doesn't want to, so he moves to a suburb of Paris, the town of Auvers-sur-Oise, where he comes under the care of Theo's acquaintance, the psychiatrist Dr. Gachet. Before that, he visits Paris for a few days to see his brother's wife, married a year ago, and their young son, Vincent. He keeps painting in Auvers. It's beautiful there. His paintings grow increasingly simplified, resembling Fauvism with twisted perspectives and vivid colors. He hardly cares about light and shadow. In the past 2 months, he painted over 70 works, producing nearly one a day like a machine. But on July 27, 1890, an event occurred that art historians still argue about to this day, and I will now tell you the most likely version. That day, as usual, he left the house with his painting supplies and went to the wheat fields near the village. But a few hours later, he came back staggering, bleeding from a gunshot wound. He stayed in bed at the hotel for 2 days. Theo rushed to him and did all he could. But on July 29, at the age of 37, Vincent van Gogh passed away with the words, "The sadness will last forever."
I risked my life for my work, and my sanity was half destroyed.
These words were in his last letter, found with him on his deathbed. There are 2 theories about what happened. The most accepted one is suicide. To support this, theorists point to the generally depressive tone of his recent letters, as well as his last painting, Wheatfield with Crows, which supposedly symbolizes a premonition of death. And this theory sounds poetic. However, it has not been reliably proven that this was his last painting. Besides, painting crows was nothing new for him. Crows were just a normal part of any field. The nature of the wound also contradicts this theory. It was located in the upper abdomen, just below the chest. Most suicide victims shoot themselves in the head or heart, but this wound doesn't match that pattern. Besides, Van Gogh never had a revolver or any other firearm. And who, planning to commit suicide, would casually take painting supplies with them, not leave a note, return home, and then fight for their life for 2 days? I can't imagine that Van Gogh, planning suicide, wouldn't at least leave a note for his brother. After the wound to his stomach, none of his vital organs were damaged, which allowed him to return to the hotel and survive for another 2 days. The doctors couldn't remove the bullet, and Vincent died from internal bleeding and infection. Antibiotics wouldn't exist for another 40 years, and sepsis was killing many people, so what might have happened? According to the latest research by Van Gogh's biographers, there is a theory that it was an accident. Evidence suggests that while Van Gogh was in Auvers, 2 teenagers often played with a revolver. And researchers have concluded that most likely it was an accident, that the teenagers were fooling around and accidentally shot the artist. For my part, I'll add with some doubt, aware of how cruel teenagers can be and how Van Gogh was seen by others. One-eared, skinny, toothless, twitchy, half-crazy vagabond. It is quite possible that these 2 teenagers started making fun of the artist. It's impossible to accidentally fire a revolver and hit the only person in a vast field. At the very least, someone's hand must have aimed the barrel. "Don't blame anyone, I did it," answered Van Gogh to the questions. And these words, interpreted as a confession of suicide, rather sound like a desire to protect someone, to cover for them, like acceptance of his own fate. He was very glad that his brother had come and admitted, "I would like to go just like this." That's how he died, in the arms of his beloved brother, surrounded by his works, already tired from this endless battle in which he had only just begun to win. He was buried right here. Friends and family came to the funeral. Emile Bernard, who never reached Arles, wrote, "The coffin was covered with yellow sunflowers, his favorites. His paintings hung in the room Wheatfields he saw as a symbol of eternity. Local artists like Pissarro and friends from Paris attended the funeral. Everyone cried. 6 months later, Theo van Gogh died at 33 from progressive paralysis, which claimed him in a month. He was buried in Utrecht, but in 1914 his body was exhumed and reburied next to his brother. Their graves remain side by side today. After Theo's death, his widow Johanna, who had over 200 unsold Van Gogh paintings and more than 600 of his letters, tried to promote his art by organizing exhibitions and exchanges, sending his paintings to museums. But it took another 11 years for the world to be ready to appreciate Van Gogh's work. In 1901, a solo exhibition of the artist took place, which became a real sensation. The exhibition was preceded by many discussions, and as a result, expressionists like Munch, Kirchner, and Kandinsky recognized Van Gogh as their forerunner. In 1905, 400 of his works were exhibited in Amsterdam, and in 1914, Johanna catalogued and published Van Gogh's letters, which revealed the genius of the artist's vision and inner world, a part of which I have introduced to you today. Van Gogh is elevated from an eccentric experimenter to one of the ideological geniuses of color. Museums in Germany and France start buying Van Gogh's paintings. After his death, Johanna passed Van Gogh's legacy to her son Vincent, who in 1973 became one of the founders of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, transferring the family collection there. Thus ended the story of Vincent's rise, who believed only in himself all his life and was elevated to the top by another Vincent. An incredible story, isn't it? Friends, I have one request for you. I run this channel alone, and each video takes a lot of work, so they're released rarely. But together, we are creating the best art channel on Runet, that's without a doubt. And your support would be very helpful to me. Please subscribe, even for the smallest donations here on YouTube, or on Boosty, or on Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. And thank you for watching. Goodbye, everyone.